Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Pothier from the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, and it's my pleasure today to be talking to Robin Pasensi from the organization My Vote Counts. Robin is the party funding researcher at MVC. Welcome, Robin. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. Glad to be here.
Right, we've just had an election. We've had all the excitement of the government of national unity and so on. But I want to go back to a short time before the election, when Parliament passed the Electoral Matters Amendment Act, bill as it was signed into law by the President, I think around about 3 weeks before the elections. And the amendments were brought about mostly to accommodate the fact that we had independent candidates standing in the election. But it also did certain other things. And you say on your website at My Vote Counts that the act was also used opportunistically by the ANC to undermine political party funding laws. So, can you explain exactly how this undermines the laws on party funding?
Absolutely. So first, I'll just give some contextual background. We only have one law that really dictates how political parties and now independents receive private donations. In other words, money that doesn't come from the state. And this law we've only had since the 1st of April 2021. So almost 3 decades into democracy was when we first got this law. So it's been very new. So you mentioned the Electoral Matters Amendment Act. As you said already, there was consequential amendments that needed to happen after the introduction of independent candidates. So obviously, as you'll recall, for quite a number of years, there was a long electoral reform process, and out of that was that independents should be allowed to contest at the national level. So ostensibly, when the bill was drafted, it was to allow independents to now be included in the Electoral Act for that purpose, which they weren't. And then other connected pieces of legislation also had to be amended where they spoke about electoral politics in any way, shape, or form. So the Political Party Funding Act was one of those. So we understood that and we expected that there would be some changes. But of course, because this was consequential amendments, we had assumed that it will be very superficial. So in other words, when you see the word political party, we now wanted to see the word independent candidate or independent representative. But instead, it actually went a lot deeper than that. And there were really a few major issues. So number one is that the law established limits on donation. So you can only donate up to 15 million rand in any 1 year to a political party. And then if you receive a donation of 100,000 rand or more, then you must disclose. So those are the two foundational limits. And that, especially that 100,000, that was our way into actually getting this funding transparency. So the act as it was declared that as a limit, but then it also said it is at the president's discretion after a resolution from the National Assembly where he can amend those. But with the changes to the law, actually, it doesn't specify any limit. It doesn't say that the disclosure threshold is 100,000, and it doesn't say that the upper limit is 15 million rand. But it still says that it's for the president to set those limits. So it lies entirely with him now. The act doesn't dictate what it is. It's entirely for the president to say what it is. The National Assembly did pass a resolution, 6th Parliament did, before it dissolved and we had elections, but the president hasn't set any limit. So what it means is that right now, anybody can donate any amount. I mean, you could donate 100 million rand. We wouldn't know. There's no obligation to disclose it. And because there's no obligation to disclose it, you won't see it in the public domain. That's really the main issue. And the other one that we took, I think, umbrage with as well is that there's a very small fund of public money that's administered under this act as well. The Represented Political Parties Fund. And that was done on a 1/3 equitable basis and 2/3 proportional.
Yeah.
So sort of a 60-33 split. But with the new change, it's now a 90-10 split. So basically your larger parties are now going to get an even larger share of that public money that's coming through. And the law was specifically, when it was drafted, was done so to address that disparity with smaller parties and larger parties. And as you can imagine, with this taking place just before the elections, it meant that if any disbursements of public money was coming through that fund, smaller parties were going to be on the losing end. So that's really the two major issues that we had. There's no funding transparency. There's an increase in public funding.
Right. Now, we know from when the Political Party Funding Act itself was passed some years back, the ANC was not the only party that had big reservations about transparency. A lot of other parties did as well. So in this particular case, with the amendments to the Electoral Matters Act, how did the other parties vote?
To be quite honest with you, most of them, when it came to the vote in the National Assembly, almost each and every one of them voted for the act. In the portfolio committee meetings as well, we made submissions. We sat in on some of those meetings. The only person, quite funnily enough, was the DA MP that routinely raised concerns around the same things that I had just mentioned. But of course, overwhelming majority, everybody else assented to the changes and it went through. So it's following on a long track record of most, if not all, political parties really pushing on the fact of we don't want our funding to be made public. We don't actually want limits or any kind of curtailment on what we're doing. So yeah, it's been an uphill battle to get broad-based political support for this.
Now, let's look at why it's important, because some political parties did argue back then. They said, look, we're private organizations. This is not public funding we're talking about. This is private donations from corporates, from rich individuals, even from not so rich individuals. Why is it important, in your view, for democracy that we should have transparency around party funding?
Yeah, it's quite funny because there's a joke in the office that some people make, is that political parties want to be seen as sort of tennis clubs or any other voluntary association. We just come together, and sometimes we talk politics. And when my vote counts went to the Western Cape High Court in 2016, when we challenged the constitutionality of the Promotion of Access to Information Act, we were saying that the act says that whether you are a private body or a public body, in actual fact, if you hold information that any member of the public deems necessary for the exercise of their right to make an informed political decision and to vote, in fact, they should be allowed to request that information. And what the court found, and the Concord later upheld, was that actually it doesn't matter if a political party is a private body. There are instances where you are actually acting in service of the public. You are performing a public good. Now we also have independence, but at the time were the only vehicle in which people could actually see political decision-making happen. So you are performing something for the public. So you can make this request. And the court was very emphatic in that private funding information is central for an informed electorate. They need to know who's funding in order to understand whether the money correlates with your policy, decision-making, or anything else that you do. So while political parties may sort of cry foul over the fact that, oh, this is an invasion of our sort of private funding privacy, in actual fact, you have information that the public needs to know. And the court was very clear on that. So you should be making that public.
Right. So now it's about 5 years, I think, since the Political Party Funding Act came into force back in 2019. And parties have been reporting, I think it's on a quarterly basis, to the IEC about the donations they've received. In general, what are the main things that we've learned so far from those reports?
Well, before I answer that, I just want to say that as a matter of interest, the law was signed in 2019, but the president only gave a date of promulgation. It only came into effect in 2021. So very long time from signing. So we actually only had 3 years. Yeah. So quite a long process. And in that 3 years, major trend is that you have a very, very small group of funders who are funding up to 70% of the total private donations that political parties receive. So it is a very small pool. You don't see much small donations, many small donations rather. It's mostly the Oppenheimer family, Patrice Motsepe, Michal Leroux. Those are the major donors, and they are only donating to a select few in terms of political parties. So, of course, you can guess the larger ones. So the ANC, the DA, interestingly enough, Action SA as well, who was then unrepresented nationally. And then in the run-up to the elections, it expanded slightly to other upstarts like Rise and Zanzi as well, who got a lot of money, actually. But that's the major takeaway, is that our political parties rely heavily on private donors. But I'm always at pains to say that the law is actually allows for a very small window of transparency. This is only for private donations above 100,000 Rand. We actually don't know who's donating below that amount. It's unclear. But also, we cannot track other forms of income that they may have. So if they own property, if they are receiving rents from that, for example, investments, all of those things are actually still sort of veil of secrecy. So in the past 3 years, I think we are now up to about 600 million Rand or so in private donations that has come in. So a lot of money, but still not the whole picture of what we see in terms of private money that's working its way in politics.
And that figure of 100,000 rands, I mean, to political parties, that might not sound like a lot, but to you and me, it's a lot of money.
Oh,
When
it
we did
is.
our submission on this act back in probably 2017, 18, when it was still a bill, amongst many other organizations, CPLO argued that the threshold should be 10,000 rands.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, where would you put it if you could yourself?
Well, actually, officially for my vote counts, we are putting it at 0. We want absolutely everything to be declared and made public. We actually launched a court application last year in May. It will be heard in mid-August, so in a few weeks' time, precisely on this matter, saying that actually the 100,000, to your point, is really high. A lot of things can be done with donations just below that. And in the spirit of full transparency, actually everything a political party gets should be made public. So the answer is 0. Everything should be out there.
Right. And have there been any examples yet where parties have failed to disclose and it's been actually established that they should have and they didn't, and then the IEC, I guess, is empowered to take some sort of action against them? Has that happened yet?
Yes, it has actually. So what we had, I think it was in April, it was just before the elections. So one of the things that political parties are mandated to do under the Act is they must provide audited financial statements of all their private funding donations to the IEC, and they publish it in a report as well. And compliance to that was abysmal, actually.
Yeah.
And they took, I forget the actual number, but close to 500 political parties to the Electoral Court for failing to comply with this particular provision. And all but one were fined. So I think the 6 larger parties were fined something like 40,000 Rand, if I'm not mistaken, and the rest were fined about 10,000 Rand. So the IEC is, I think, taking it seriously, but just on those numbers, there's a lot that the party funding unit in the IEC has to do. But they are, I think, as far as they are able to, trying to enforce that. And perhaps in the years to come, we'll see even more taking place in that space.
Now, you mentioned earlier the fund that receives private money administered by the IEC, that then can parcel out money in a proportional basis to the different parties. Not just for people's information, there are in fact 2 sources of money for political parties administered by the IEC. One is the Represented Political Party Fund, which gets an allocation from Parliament of taxpayers' money. And the IEC then parcels that out to the different parties that are represented in our legislatures. And then there's the MultiParty Democracy Fund, which basically invites members of the public to donate money, corporates and so on, to donate money to the IEC, which is then again put into a fund and can be parceled out to support electoral activities and so on. Let's just look at each of these in turn. The Represented Political Parties Fund, which is administering taxpayers' money, how is that operating?
I mean, so far the IAC has been doing the job, I think, quite efficiently in dispersing that. I mean, look, here the IAC is just a functionary. It's not as though they are going out to raise the money. As you said, this comes from the public purse. This is our taxpayer money that gets allocated to them from National Treasury. It's budgeted for. All the IAC does is it hands it out. With the change to the party funding law brought on by the Electoral Matters Amendment Act, this is done, like I said earlier, on a 90-10 split. So in other words, 90% of the money will be given on a proportional basis. So the amount of seats that you have in a national or provincial legislature, parliament, and the 10% will be given on an equitable basis. So obviously, as you can imagine, the more seats you have, the better it is for you. You're going to get more money. Previously, it was on a 1/3, 2/3 split. So it's much increased from that. I think our issue remains on that particular fund that the incumbent parties, the large parties, will continue to grow, can continue to add to their sort of pot, while small parties, emerging parties are going to find it extremely difficult. Again, if you only have one seat in parliament, what does that actually mean for you in practical terms? So that's still a concern for us, the disparity between the bigger established parties and the smaller ones.
And then the other fund, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, this is where you and I and corporates and everybody else can donate money to the IEC. Last time I heard, I think they'd only received about 25 million rands in total. How's that one going?
I mean, unfortunately, the answer there is not very well. I think it was obviously an idealized notion that if we have this fund, this communal pot, as it were, people would be sort of jazzed about putting money in this, because now you don't have to be associated with a particular party. You don't have to fear reputational blowback for giving your money here. And you can just sort of donate in the spirit of democracy, and that can go for big corporates to sort of every man on the street. But it's not worked out that way. We've had very few corporates. In fact, I think it was Vodacom who is given the most so far. Very few individual take up of this. And so obviously what this means is that political parties don't get lots of money from that fund. It's dispersed on the same split, the 90-10 split. But the take up has been exceptionally slow. I don't think it's working out as what it was envisioned to be.
Yeah, right. So that's the situation in a nutshell in our country. Let's just look briefly at elsewhere. How does our overall party funding situation compare to other multi-party democracies? Are there places that we can learn from, or are we in fact doing better than some of the more well-established democracies?
Well, if we just take on the continent, we just take on Africa, South Africa actually comes out pretty much on top. We have some of the most progressive party funding laws. So even given what I said earlier, that it took us almost 30 years to have one law in place, it actually goes quite far into trying to provide some kind of framework for transparency around funding. Again, just keeping an eye on the continent, you have places like Zambia who have been pushing this but haven't yet been able to get it right, for example. And it's a major concern. So for us, in terms of the continent, I would say we are pretty up there, but it's still an imperfect law. Globally speaking, most countries do have some kind of party funding law. But really, what it comes down to is more the intricacies of how this works. Most of them will have some mix of allowing for public funding and private funding, similar to what we have. But I think the main difference that we could possibly learn from is that they track expenditure. So in the UK, for example, when you are submitting your disclosures, as it were, you also have to account for what you've spent the money on, which I think is a crucial component of the accountability portion of private funding. In South Africa, we don't have that. So even if Robin receives R1 million, all good and well, I've disclosed it, but what did I spend it on? What did I do? So I think just in that part of your question, I think that it's really becomes highly individualistic given the whatever socio-political context of the country. But I think one thing that we can take away is that we may need to look at including some provision around expenditure and then also along procurement, because that thus far has not been included on the sort of corruption point. So two things we could look at.
Right. Then just to come back finally to kind of where we started. We're sitting now with this lacuna where there's no upper limit on the total amount that a party can receive, and there is no threshold for reporting. What's the next step? As we just wait for the president to say something, or can we force this issue?
Well, we tried to force the issue. We had an urgent interdict early May, so just I think about 2 weeks out from the elections, 2-3 weeks out. And while the judgment was that they recognized that there is in fact a lacuna, the judge did not sort of have a judgment where it forced the president to actually set those. And some of the arguments were deferred to our court case that's coming up in mid-August. So we are hopeful that out of that, we could possibly have something that moves the president closer towards setting the limits, because as I said, he did receive the National Assembly resolution to make those limits. He just needs to gazette those. He just needs to make it public. So the longer he waits, we're just going to continue in the sort of limbo period that we are in. And I will just say we have added to our court cases coming up in August that for this period between, I think, the 8th of May, that's when the Electoral Matters Amendment Act came into place, up until whenever we are in court, that particular period, retrospectively, if we can have access to that party funding, that would have happened in that space. So hopefully we can also have that.
Great. Thank you. Robin Pasensi, political party funding researcher at My Vote Counts. Thanks for your time, Robin, and thanks for the great work that My Vote Counts is doing for our democracy.
Thank you. Highly appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Please have a look at our website to see the other videos that are available, and I hope to see you again for the next one. Thanks. Bye-bye.